Kia ora koutou and welcome to this public workshop, Consideration of a District-Wide Emissions Reduction Target and Plan. Welcome to elected members, welcome to members of the public who've come today. So I've got a little bit of a setup there so that we don't have any room around the table because we've got a really good turnout today from community boards as well as councillors. So I've set up a microphone that public can use one at a time there at the end of the table. So the plan is today that we'll go all the way through the briefing with questions at the end. But before we do that, I'll just invite, I've had a request, members of the public they represent organisations and would like to identify who they are and where they come from. So I'll invite them to do that now, just name and organisation at this point, because we've got a full briefing and we'll have lots of questions, I'm sure, at the end. Maybe come up one at a time and just...
Kia ora tātou, my name is Dr. Christina Hood. I'm a consultant on climate policy. A million years ago, I was actually the climate advisor at this council, but have worked in New Zealand and internationally since then, and including advice to the government on our NDC and budgets. So if you have questions about what any of those targets mean, I can help.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Just quickly, one by one. Yep.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Paul Callister. I'm an economist and I work on sustainable transport issues, particularly trains, planes and cycling, and I'm also part of Low Carbon Capital.
Great to have you here, Paul. Who's next?
Hello, I'm Deirdre Kent. I'm a member of Low Carbon Capital and represented them on the Waste Management Task Force 2019.
Thank you, Deirdre.
Kia ora, I'm Olga Speranska. I'm an economist and I've been running Waste Free Kapiti, which is a Facebook page, not an organisation, for the last 5 years.
Thank you.
Kia ora everyone, I'm Sarah Kress, community midwife. I'm also a member of Low Carbon Kapiti and other environmental advocate organisations.
Thanks, it's great to have such a full representation from different organisations around Kapiti. Welcome today, and I hope you enjoy this session. So I'll pass over to Brandy now and we'll get through this presentation. Thanks.
Kia ora. Thank you all for being here today. It's really great to see such good turnout. My name is Dr. Brandy Griffin. I am your Principal Policy Advisor in Climate Change. My PhD is in economy and political science and social science research methods. What's interesting about today, let me start with an outline. Oh, wrong button. I want to start a little bit by setting some background that sets in context to some of the decisions that were made in the last triennium and how that impacts where we are today and where we want to go next. I'll very briefly talk about some of the existing targets that we already have at a national, international, regional level. And then we'll get into, if you wanted to set a target, what we might set as a target, and most importantly, what we might do to help meet those targets. And then next steps for what we need to do, because today is a workshop, it's a public workshop, but any decisions that you want to make have to come back through a council report, through a council meeting. As you guys will see, because there are so many of us here, we will certainly provide time at the end for questions, comments, discussion. But if we run out of time and not everybody gets to have their say, you'll see back here behind you, I have some slides up on the wall. And everybody has 4 different sets of stickers: green, yellow, red, and a tiny one that will be different colors. And I've put on the table behind us, behind you over here in the corner, some sticky pads and some pins. Because what we would like you to do before you leave today is, after we go through the conversation, and we've talked about, a lot of today's discussion will be about prioritization, how you want to use the funds that you have as a council, and where you want to put the most energy and where we go next. The green means it's an idea you really like and you really feel like, yep, it's a go. We want you to do this first. The red means I actually don't like this idea at all. We don't want to put any energy into this. Put a red sticky up. You have one of 3 of those. The yellow means, you know what, I like this idea, but I feel like it's not a priority. Let's put this a few LTPs later. The little sticker is supposed to be like a gold star, which means the first thing I think we should do. This is the most important. And if there's not an idea up there, use the stickies to say what else we could be thinking about. We're always open to new ideas, and that would be great. So just as I go through the PowerPoint, you'll continue to see this picture of the signal light pop up. And those are the moments where I'm saying that is actually one of the slides that's on the wall, and you can vote later on that. Is that clear? All right, moving on, because I know we have limited time. To begin with, I wanted to say, I have seen that there's been some concerns about, hey, we don't have a strategy, but you have a framework. What's the purpose of that? Well, what's really interesting, I bring this up from the start. We do have a vision that's set through the framework, and it's the vision that Kapiti has reduced its carbon footprint significantly, transitioned to a low-carbon future, and is prepared for challenges and opportunities that come from responding to this climate crisis. I'm pointing this out from the start, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how this framework came about in a minute. But just to explain that those 3 arms, to me, translate to mitigation, adaptation, and transition. There's a lot of different things we need to do to respond to the climate crisis. We've spent more energy in the last 3 years working in some areas than others. And it's great that we have a lot of people here today to say we want to see more action in additional areas. We've always known that there were gaps that needed to be filled, and we're here to have this conversation about what do we need to do to fill that. I tend to think of the Climate Emergency Action Plan. It actually embodies coming back to this mitigation, adaptation, and transition. You have been working, as Ninka explained this morning, in the corporate mitigation space for a very long time, since 2009. We've had plans in place, we've been working with Toitu EnviroCare, and as Ninka explained this morning, we are now in the process, oh, did I say it wrong?
No.
Oh, sorry. I thought, did I misspeak? Toitu EnviroCare. Sorry, no, it's not a problem. That is an area where you have very clear, although we are revising where we're going to go next, but you've had clear plans, strategies, and budget in place for a long time. Also, in terms of adaptation of council services and assets, we had some conversations this morning about flooding, stormwater. This is where in the last several of years I've spent the most of my energy working very closely with your activity managers to make sure that they understand the climate change projections for our district and that they are incorporating that data into how we plan and deliver our services, particularly our essential services related to water, wastewater, stormwater, and roading. And you do have in these documents that I list here, there are strategies in place. We explain what our response is. The issue here is resourcing. You do have, without a doubt, activity managers and contracted experts that do understand what they're doing, but there's always more that we can do, and a lot of this relates to budget constraints. As Sean explained earlier, we have like a 37-year stormwater management strategy, and even then, as we continue to grow and build and develop in new areas, you know, there's more work to be done. Adaptation in terms of supporting the communities and the businesses, there's work in process here. We have the Takatai Kapiti project that's currently underway, the flood map upgrade. There's quite a bit going on with the Wellington Regional Growth Framework. They have a sub-strategy in place doing impact assessments across the region. And there's 2 aspects of how we use that data. Council, we have to use that data to manage our own services and assets, but we also have to think about how that impacts land rules and land use planning and how we can support neighbors. And those are really difficult conversations, as you know, and those are in process. But you'll see the 2 areas here are district-wide mitigation and transition. Oh, excuse me. And that is what we are here to talk about today. Without a doubt, we agree that there is more that a council could be doing in this area, but we also then need to talk about how we want to fund that or prioritize or redistribute funds to carry out that kind of work. So We've always known there are some areas that you do very well, you as a council, that we've been doing it for a long time. There are other areas where there is room for improvement, without a doubt. I did want to say one more thing about the framework. What was interesting is years ago, we used to have, back when we talked to Dr. Hood and Christian and others when they worked in council, we had quite a bit, we had a much bigger team and we had a lot of strategy. I will definitely say in the last triennium, your council had some very tough decisions to make. We have a housing crisis. We've learned, these are just examples, we've learned that there are some buildings where, like the Waikanae Library, we had mold issues, it needs to be rebuilt. They've had to make some tough decisions about redirecting funding to other areas. And those are some of the decisions that you're going to have to make in this triennium. We used to have some programs that we don't offer as widely as we used to because we've had to redirect funding. So we're going to come back to, this is the voting on where do we want to go next and how are we going to fund it. What we did find, though, is after council declared a climate change emergency, the reason why we wanted a framework, we actually had a lot of discussions across council about what is our role. And we were not all, well, I'll be honest, we weren't all entirely aligned. Through that work of developing the framework and working within our council, we've spent a lot of the last couple of years getting our house in order. And the framework has been fundamental for that internally. So, yeah, just to give you a little bit of a background context. So as you know, the last council knew in the last triennium that district-wide emissions was something they wanted to think about next. On the 9th of August, we had a briefing where we talked about it, and they requested more community input. That is why we did that very quick 1-month survey. And previous briefings, you've received the link to that, but if you need it in the future, I can provide that again. So we carried out that survey online from August to September, 612 respondents. Once again, we appreciate it was online and in libraries, so people self-select who's going to respond. There are different ways to engage with the community, but that was one way to do it quite quickly. And what we realized is people really cared about climate change, or they were really, we had a small group that were still not very concerned about this issue. But 75.1% of respondents said they were concerned or very concerned. 64% felt that we should have a target. What is interesting is when we went back and spoke to council on 27 September, they decided they were leaning towards setting kind of a combination target of a 2050 goal, probably that aligns with the national direction, and maybe some interim targets to help us develop plans and to do more work around that. But they did not want to make that decision. They wanted to welcome the new council to do that. They wanted us to come back to you. So this is the first time we've been able to do that. In October, you had your elections, you had your inductions, you had your summer holidays. So it has taken a while, but here we are. What are the existing targets? As we say, it's not like there are no targets at all. We do have international and national targets. And at the international level, through the Glasgow Climate Pact, you have the target of global emissions cut 50% by 2030. Ninka talked about that a little bit this morning, so I won't go into detail. I do want to say one thing, though, that's quite interesting when I get into this discussion later about what is transition and what does that mean. At that meeting, New Zealand also signed the Supporting the Conditions for a Just Transition internationally declaration. And we now also have within central government where a transition strategy is being developed. We're going to come back to what that means in a moment because it speaks to the wide array of things that you could do to support your community. We have our nationally determined contribution, and then we, oh, sorry, I don't want to get a laser pointer in your eye. The Climate Change Response Act. Net zero GHG emissions by 2050, excluding biogenic methane. Biogenic methane emissions cut 24 to 40% by 2050, 10% by 2030. I'm going to come back to these. You don't necessarily need to write these down now. I just want to say there are national and international targets that exist. So what are most councils doing with that information? Here's just a few councils. Most of them are aligning with the net zero by 2050 through the Climate Change Response Act. Some are then I have an example here. Christchurch, they've decided to go a little bit stronger. They're going net zero by 2045. We also understand there are currently some reviews in process at Christchurch because they know that that's a very tough target to meet. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't set a difficult target, but they're debating that. There are some that, for example, Hutt City Council has talked about the biogenic methane target. Pororua City Council is a council like our size. They have not set an interim target. They realized, as Ninka was saying this morning, they have some more work to do, but they have gone with the net zero by 2050. There are regional and sector-specific targets that I'm going to talk about as we move forward. But the reason why I pointed this out is later you'll see when we start to propose, if you wanted to set a target, what it could be. Without a doubt, at minimum, it's net zero by 2050. That's kind of the basic long-term target that aligns with the Climate Change Response Act. I also wanted to point out, if you can see down below, like for Auckland and Christchurch, they are currently against a 2016 baseline. Wellington City and Hutt City are against a 2020 baseline because that's our most recent data. It's actually 2018-19 data that was published in 2020, because if we talk about setting a target, we need to talk about our baseline. And I will say this, some of the national and international are from an earlier baseline than that. So where are we at now at 2020? Some of you will have seen this already, but I just wanted to remind us once again, this is your district profile, your most recent district profile, published in 2020, carried out by ACOM for Greater Wellington Regional Council. We could get into, there's lots of discussions about how they measure and allocate greenhouse gas emissions. It's not a perfect tool, but it gives us the best idea that we have. Gross emissions were 351,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2018-19. Net emissions were 286,000. I point this out simply to say that in that year, the harvest emissions were 99,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That was actually quite a bit of harvesting that took place that year, and we took a hit in terms of what our net emissions were. They'd been lower before because we'd had more sequestration occurring in the district. Those will be replanted, and in time, I'm sure, it'll go back, but it leads to that discussion that Sophie and Ninka started to have earlier this morning, and we'll come back to in a minute. Is there room that something we want to do in the sequestration space? In our district, because your council is not a large landowner, we are often at the mercy of others in terms of what they choose to do with their forestry. And like someone had said earlier, there might be rules around that and things that we can do to manage that, but it is something we would need to think about. I'm not going to go into the fine print here, but your biggest source of emissions is from transportation, 57%. I'm going to talk about transport in more detail shortly. Stationary energy is the next biggest source, 17%. Agriculture is 12%, but I'm actually not going to talk much about agriculture today. Since 2001, your agricultural emissions have reduced by 41%, and that is primarily because your district is becoming more urbanized. We don't have as many methane emitting livestock in the district as we did back in 2001, and I suspect that trend is likely to continue. Waste is 9%, and industry, which is industrial emissions that don't come from energy usage, they come from other things here like refrigerants, foam blowing, fire extinguishers. They are industrial processes that sometimes emit emissions. They are currently 5%. This is what your profile has looked like since 2000, 2001. As you'll notice, the blue line is net emissions and how they have slowly increased over time. This is population. So you can see that there is a correlation. I can look at net or gross emissions per capita over time, and they do fluctuate a bit, but for the most part, in some areas like transport, they're actually growing. They're not decreasing. Your per capita emissions from transport have grown, not reduced. So that's something interesting to think about when we think about what kind of programs do you want to have. Where do you want to focus? So with this information, we have a baseline. We have an idea of what other councils are doing. We have an idea of what the national and international targets are. What do we want to do with this? Well, I think what I'm trying to drive home as we go through this is, I think you have some tough decisions to make as a council. Where are we going to put our energy and our resource and our focus area? And I think, if you want to go, I saw some discussions on Facebook that we wanted to go harder, faster. If you want to go harder, faster, we need to think about how you're going to do that. So that being said, let's briefly talk about roles and responsibilities. As we know, council is one part of this. Council does have an important role. We can advocate on the behalf of our district. We can lead. We can role model. We can educate, raise awareness. We can plan, fund, and deliver, but you'll notice that I have within constraints. So in a sense, you have three sources of funding. You have your rates income, and you can increase rates, or you can prioritize funding from other areas that you've been focused on, or we often can get funding from central government for key pieces of work that we do. Transport's really important. But if central government chooses not to fund us, then you need to decide, are you then going to redirect some of your own funding to do that? And we've seen that a lot in some of the different work programs, and that'll become more clear. Central government and regional government constantly have a role to help us create a better environment. System change is huge, and as we've said before, what is often we see people picking up in terms of behavior change, the biggest improvement is when we have a larger structure that makes it easy for us. We've done away with plastic bags. We, are continuing to do away with plastic bags. There's discussions about, food waste to the landfill and what can we do to reduce that. Central government is looking at plans and regulations that they would put in place. That makes it easier for all of us, I think. And we want to advocate and try and work with our central and regional partners to try and create a setting that supports the work that we're trying to do. But at the same time, we have mana whenua, local businesses, individuals, and communities. A lot of it is about our behavior change. And with that, I want to ask one question. How did you all get here today? Some of us have an e-car. Some of us came on our bike. And that's the thing. So we can do a lot to try and make things as good as possible, as supportive and enabling as possible, but we do have to try and drive behavior change or do something to understand what it is that we can help people. So we're going to come back to that again. I know I keep saying we're coming back to that. Here's where the rubber hits the road. The idea of what we want to do, whatever target you set, we need to, if you want to put your money where your mouth is, we need to develop a plan to get there. This is an example of how you would start to think about where would we reduce emissions, where could we get the biggest bang for our buck. For example, if you wanted to go 50% emission reduction by 2030, we could aim for 50% across transport, waste, electricity, and then think about what do we need to do to drive that. What you'll notice up here is I have 57% reduction because that's what Wellington City Council is going for. They've set a really ambitious target using the One Planet a framework a tool because they believe looking at the Human Development Index, New Zealand could do more. We have a higher HDI than some countries. Of course, that was before last week's cyclone and things like that, but yeah. So I hope that you're following along with me. I hope I've been clear. If not, please make a note. I'm happy to go back to make sure that this is all hanging together. But with transport, 57% of our emissions. There are transport-specific targets that do currently exist. Through your National Emissions Reduction Plan, there are 4 targets. They relate to reducing vehicle kilometers traveled by the light fleet, increasing the number of zero-emission vehicles that we can support, freight transport, intensity of transport fuel. Some of those might not be targets that you would want to take up at a local level. The Wellington Regional Land Transport Plan at the moment, they have a 40% increase in active transport and public transport, 35% reduction in transport-generated emissions by 2030, both of those. 40% reduction in deaths and serious injuries, so safety is a big part of it. I would also say that I believe you guys had a briefing last week or the week before from Ministry of Transport. Yeah. They are setting a Wellington Regional Vehicle Kilometers Traveled target, but that's still under discussion. We think it should be completed quite soon. There's a briefing that we've been invited to this week, but it's definitely going to be in place by 2023. Drawing on those targets from Greater Wellington, from the Wellington Regional Land Transport Plan, Greater Wellington has also set 2 transport targets: 40% increase in walking, cycling, and public transport use, 35% reduction in emissions from land transport by 2030. They also have a reduction in emissions from public transport, which is really great, but we would also want to see a target getting public transport to the farthest reaches of the region, because we know that bus and train is something that we've been lobbying for years. If we wanted to reduce our transport emissions by, say, 50%, currently as of the 2018-19 AECOM report, it was just under 200,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Nearly 70%, or just over 70% of that, is petrol and diesel usage. They tell us in the report primarily from light vehicles. You also have 15.5% from jet kerosene, which, as you know, there's been a lot of campaigning around whether we should or should not have the airport. 8.4% as well from marine diesel, because we're a boating community and we love our boats. But let's just look at the total. If we're looking at that 200,000 and we wanted to reduce 50% by 2030, that would be just under 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent we would need to reduce. Just to give you an idea of what that looks like, if we wanted to, between now and 2030, that's 7 years, it's 14,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. That is about 3 standard Olympic-sized swimming pools of gasoline every single year that we do not consume. That is 407,000 round trips to Wellington that we do not take in 1 year in our car. That is 3,075 cars each year that we remove from the road. And by those cars, I mean average passenger vehicles where someone uses their car a lot, not someone who uses an electric car or not someone who uses in a car periodically. I will say a caveat for these. I used a U.S. Environmental Protection Agency tool to get these estimates. These are estimates. They are not perfect because I had to do calculations to, kilograms to or kilometers to miles, gallons to liters. So I may not have it 100%, but the idea is we have a lot of work to do in this space. That's what I'm trying to communicate. What could we do? So here's some different ideas, and you'll see the stoplight. This is one of the slides that I have up. Transport. We can enable active transport. We already do that, but I hear from some members of the community that they would like to see more. I've also seen people say, but I don't think council has applied for a lot of the different central government funding rounds. It's actually not true. Council has applied, and we've been declined. Yeah. So what's interesting in instances like that is we have to decide if we want to do more bike lanes, or we want to do bike lane protectors, or we want to do more for safety and crossings. Once again, we either need to raise rates, redirect funding from other programs into this, or think about things like paid parking or other incentives that would paid parking would provide an income, but it would also discourage people from driving. So what I've done here, and you see the red arrow on the left, there are some things that you are already doing. CW Network, safety program. There are more ideas that you could do. These are just a few. If you want to accelerate enabling active transport. And you have to decide, if central government doesn't fund something, do you want to fund it yourself? So that's something interesting to think about, and I think they're really tough decisions. Also, advocating for improved public transport. I've worked here since 2015. I was going to say 2015 years. 2015, it feels that way sometimes. Every time we have ever written any submissions to Greater Wellington, to NZ Rail, to Ministry of Transport, we have always argued we need more electrified rail, we need more bus options, we need more public transport options. And we've made arguments about these are the demographics in the farthest part of your district. This is why these people need these services. There is all kinds of issues around public transport. After a while, you can start to ask yourself, we should continue to lobby and advocate. But another option is, if they don't provide, do you fund? Do you fund some additional programs? That's something else to think about. Increase zero-emission vehicles. I noticed when we did the survey, and I'm referring to the quick 1-month survey that we did in the previous triennium, where they were asking for feedback from the public about setting targets and what we should do. Some people said EV vehicles are wonderful. We really want to promote that. Other people said, we don't want you to spend time in that space. Tomorrow, we actually have a meeting here through the Greater Wellington Regional Growth Framework. There is a Wellington Regional Emissions Reduction Strategy being developed. And I can tell you, Wellington Electricity and Electra and others are in that working group. They're coming here tomorrow morning for a meeting, because the electric company understands that there is going to be an expectation for more EVs, and they need to figure out what they can do to support that. We are in the process, we've been converting our own fleet. We are in the process of developing a new EV and e-bike network charging plan. But once again, we might put some funding into the EV chargers that currently exist in the district. They have our logo. That's because we wrote grant proposals to get funding for them. We worked in partnership with Hortofino and others. But we have not traditionally built those chargers. Once again, if you want to see more EV chargers, we need to partner, we need to advocate, we need to possibly fund them ourselves. There's a common theme here. One thing Wellington City Council does that we have never done, and if you like this idea, we could start to think about it, is part of their plan has been to really focus on shared mobility options. The bike and the scooter sharing that you can do there, the Mevo shared car rentals. We could start to explore options like that. We have not to date. And one of the biggest things, the most power that you actually have as a council, is what we can do to help reduce travel times and the need to travel. Land use planning is absolutely critical, and I'm not sure that we are there yet. We should have a lot more discussions about that. Hamish is coming to talk to you this afternoon about that. We have a district plan. We have a growth strategy that aims to enable high density on existing networks. But even though we kind of support and allow and enable that, we cannot necessarily make it happen. This has to come with partnering with developers and others, right? Economic development as well, very important. So what I would love for you to do towards the end, we can certainly talk about this and have questions, but I would also love for you to tell us what you think about some of these ideas, and if you would like us to start to focus on how we could enable some of these.
So I'm just looking at time. We've gone 35 minutes already, and I'm not seeing more than half the stack of papers.
Oh, I haven't been flipping.
No. Just link us. Yeah.
Oh, no, you're fine.
So just making sure we want to wrap this up by 10 past or quarter past to allow that conversation to happen. So yeah,
absolutely.
You might have to speed up.
Don't worry. What you're looking at is we have a bunch of slides at the end that I won't show. I brought them in case anybody has questions. Yeah.
It's not as bad as it looks.
Yeah. Don't you worry at all.
No.
This is not our first rodeo.
Transport was the biggest topic as well, I think. In this.
Yeah. Stationary energy, 17%. What's really interesting about stationary energy is households are important, but also businesses and big industry is where most of this energy gets used. So that is why looking at something like council and our own organizational emission reduction is really important. But there are bigger users across the district. We have never had a program in place where we might want to engage with them and see what we can do to help them. As Ninka said, in the last triennium, it was agreed that in year 2, this year of this LTP, we hired a sustainability advisor, Rob. He's just started. He's lovely. We need to develop a whole program of work around what you can do. But at the moment, Rob is a one-man band.
Yeah. We're getting there.
There are no energy-specific targets that I think are really important to you. What is interesting in the New Zealand energy strategy, it is more about the source of our energy, how much is renewable, aspirational targets about our grid. You had nearly 60,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2018-19. 50% of that, you'd be looking at trying to reduce about 30,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. You can see electricity consumption is 47%. 20% is stationary petrol and diesel use to drive energy, not for cars. That's separate. So some of the things that you could start to think about here. If you needed to reduce, if you wanted to meet that 50% target over 7 years, you'd be looking at about 4,300 TCO2e, I'm just going to call it that to make it easier, per annum. Equivalent, that would be like switching 162,000 light bulbs to LED every single year. But can I tell you, many years ago, council actually, we got central government funding and we did a campaign where we gave LED light bulbs to every single household with information on why this was important. So there are things that we could potentially think about. So reducing energy in households. We have a home health kit that is about to be delivered. Other councils are doing it, where you can check it out from our libraries and people can use it to go around and measure energy usage, insulation, things throughout their house, and they can look at how they can improve their house. We support the curtain bank at the in Otaki every year. That helps with energy use. We used to have a full-time eco-design advisor, and we decided for many ways there are a number of reasons why that program changed, but actually I think that FTE's been lost, and we don't really have a lot of eco-design services. Many other councils do. I talked about the LED light bulb campaign. That's just an example. Rates investment. Once again, how much do you want to do? Reducing energy use in businesses and industry. I do have PTALK up there. That's just getting started. That's the, the sustainability group of businesses. Rob will be working closely with many of them, to try and help them develop plans. Many of them are focusing on waste from the start, which is great, but then I'm sure we'll start to get into energy use, things like that. But that being said, if you really wanted to look at your biggest energy users in the district, that could be a whole program in and of itself. PTALK at the moment is just, it's if they choose to sign. We could go door knocking and say, hey, can we help you to reduce your energy? Mm-hmm. Supporting programs for existing buildings, retrofitting. Accelerating the uptake of sustainable design and construction for new buildings. There is stuff happening at the national level through the Building Act, but once again, what can we do to support, to incentivize, to encourage? Once again, land use planning, absolutely critical. I have to say that over and over again today. Land use planning is one of your biggest tools. What can we do to ensure that our public spaces support this low carbon future? I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on waste because you will get other briefings from the waste team. I don't think you've met with them a lot. But waste is currently about 9%. I'm not getting into the discussion that Ninka had earlier about wastewater treatment emissions. Those get counted within our corporate emissions. 92% of our wastes are from solid waste, and here we get into a range of greenhouse gas emissions, including the biogenic methane, because it impacts what we might put in our landfill. And that's part of the reason for the push that we've had through our waste minimization team to promote getting food waste out of garbage, because that goes straight to your landfill and it emits biogenic methane. So it is really important to try and promote people, encourage people, and give them tools to deal with their food waste in other ways. But there's a lot of stuff going on there. There is a waste target for the National Emissions Reduction Plan. It relates to that Climate Change Response Act target about biogenic methane. There is a lot happening at MFE and through our own Wellington Regional Waste Minimization Plan, but I have to tell you, it's all currently under review. It will be done within 2023, so within the next few months, you'll be getting briefings and learning more about this, but they're going to be putting some new plans in place. So at the moment you have programs and they're funded by the Zero Waste Levy. And I want to point this out as well. You have continued in the last triennium to continue to provide really good zero waste education programs. It is central government funded. Mm-hmm. So that's been earmarked to do that, to provide those services. If you wanted to do more or do it bigger or differently, once again, we'd have to think about, do we want to redirect funding? Do you want to raise rates? Do you want to do more? Some of that, I would say that a lot of our zero waste program, correct me if I'm wrong, has been focused on in the home, but there has been some with businesses, and now with Rob coming on board, there's going to be more with businesses, because we know through PTALK, the local group, that waste is a big interest to businesses. Also, there's a big national campaign to minimize construction and demolition waste. So as a result, we are establishing the Otahunga Zero Waste Hub. That will be really powerful because, as you can imagine, in Kapiti, construction and demolition waste is a lot of the waste that goes to our landfill. We have a new bylaw in place. It was in 2020 or 2021. New requirements for constructors, developers of certain size projects to develop waste management and minimization plans. And the waste team can see that that is starting to come through the consenting process, and they are having conversations about how to help and support reducing that. Advocating is something that we already do a lot of. The waste team attends a lot of these regional and national meetings and forums to provide advice and to make sure we're aligned. A really big one here is biosolids. And biosolids is something we could do a whole briefing and talk about biosolids. Yeah. They're very difficult to deal with. There are lots of new ideas out there, but it's something that will be coming up in the horizon. Yeah. Sophie briefly mentioned sequestration before. That's really the only one. I wasn't going to talk much about agriculture or more about biogenic methane or IPPU for industries. But I did just briefly want to say with sequestration, Ninka already mentioned this, but there is currently a plan in place to look at our council-owned land to figure out what are our opportunities for more planting. A lot of our large landowners in the district that do have lots of forestry or wetlands, if not all wetlands sequester, but those that do, they use a lot of those, they use it for their own benefit, basically. They use it against their own emissions. So if you wanted to further sequestration, there are things that we could do. Once again, we already fund through the Heritage Program, wetland type of support and environmental restoration projects, but we could do more in this area. Last but not least, transition. This is my third to last slide. When I talk about transition, what do I mean? Because in my mind, I'm not sure that everybody would agree, but there's a distinction. To me, when we talk about mitigation, that is supporting and enabling our communities to reduce their carbon footprint, to reduce maybe their ecological footprint as well. Transition is something slightly different, and like I said, I think that even at the national level, they're just getting their heads around that and developing a transition strategy. But part of the reason why I was providing those examples of the swimming pools and whatnot, there are significant changes required, not even at a local level, but nationally and internationally. Our whole way of living, of growing, of the way we do things needs to change. That's the only way we're actually going to be able to address this program. So it's really important to think about how we support and enable our communities to have the skills and resources required to transition to this new low-carbon future. Imagine, because of all the NZTA work that takes place in our district, which is really important work, it provides, those are lifelines roading is lifelines that we need to be able to have for civil defense emergencies and whatnot. But a lot of the people that live in our district, they work in industries that emit lots of, they're emission, I wouldn't say promoting, but emission-emitting industries, right?
Every industry.
And we know that Downers and Higgins and the others, when we talk about the supply chain, they're all thinking about how to reduce emissions and how to do it better. But it's almost like we might find that there are people in our district that even their economic livelihood might need to shift. They need to think about how do they live differently in a new future, and how are they resilient and connected when we start to have more and more natural hazard events like we've seen. So there's a lot of things I think that council could do in the transition space, but once again, you need to decide, is this your role and is this something that you want to do? You're not alone in this. I did say to Sophie on the break, when I hear that there are initiatives happening in the community that we don't know about, I think that's awesome. We want to do what we can to support them when they need us, but the whole world needs to be taking action. We don't need to do everything. So part of these tough decisions will be, you'll focus on some areas and not others, right? But local innovation, we talked about that earlier. There are some really great ideas in our community. We know that there are people working on wind farms and new solar farm ideas. We have the Climate Action Grant that you'll be in a few weeks hearing more about as Rob's presenting the policy. It's been really great that we received funding through the Better Off Funding program to support that. Education programs. We have some education programs. We could do a lot more. Behavior change program. Greater Wellington City Council has an entire team, not Greater Wellington, Wellington City, granted they have a lot more money than us, that is focused on behavior change and helping people to understand and overcome fear and think about what they can do to start to make this transition. Connected communities. Your connected community team, I keep telling everybody, is one of the most important teams in your council. It is about social sustainability. It is about sharing ideas, greener neighborhood campaigns, sustainable home and garden shows. All of those things, if you want to expand on them, you need to support that team. It is such a fundamentally important team. Economic development as well. I know Chris already made reference to this before. The Economic Development Leadership Forum, they're thinking about this. There's more that we can start to think about. Regenerative and circular economy is absolutely critical, and that's a whole mind shift. Auckland Council, that's one of the key factors of their strategy, is promoting that shift to a more regenerative and circular economy. iwi partnerships. I'm really bummed that today none of our iwi representatives were able to make it. We are talking with the iwi relationships team. I was going to say, like Connected Communities, that is one of your most important teams, but I understand we just learned last week that team is being, rebuilt, and there'll be more staff there to do more. You'll see when you look at the National Adaptation Plan, the National Emissions Reduction Plan, there is a lot in there about supporting iwi to make the transitions. And then environmental restoration and protection. There's a lot that goes on through our biodiversity and our teams that are, in the parks and open spaces area, but you could think about additional programs as well. So I know I've actually given you too much to think about. I do think it's really tough, actually. I think you have some incredibly tough decisions to make in this triennium. I wanted to explain why we've got to where we are, because there are other issues like housing crisis or maintaining the infrastructure that already exists. So that's why we'd love for you to do the voting. And then we come down to two last ideas. So step one, do you even want to set a target? If you do, we have to come back with a paper. I would definitely recommend that your 2050 target simply aligns with the Climate Change Response Act. Net zero GHG emissions by 2050. If you want to talk about biogenic methane, you could. Some councils do, others don't. I think for transport, you could set a very specific transport interim target for 2030. For waste, I feel like we should wait until we hear what they're doing through the regional waste plan. And there is the global emissions cut 50% by 2030 target, which is the international target that came out of the Glasgow Climate Pact. So we need to get a steer from you on if this is something you want to do to set a target. I can certainly do that. We'll come back with a paper. And then the next step is further work required. Yeah, we're getting into Vision 2050. That's the last bit here.
Yes, oh yeah, it was there.
Yeah, it's the last bit. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten.
No, I didn't know it was on.
How do we move forward? It's with your vision and your plan, of course, you want that to be bigger than an annual plan or a long-term plan. So Vision 2050, the work you're starting to do with Chris, is absolutely fundamental. And I'm really excited to see that even from the initial discussions that I've sat in with this, you've had discussions about maybe using something like a donut economic model to think about decision making. Because I think sometimes when we say, you know, we need to work in this area, we're going to have to redirect some funding, people may not realize that we have actually redirected funding. And as we grow council in some areas, we might decrease it in others. So I'm hoping that we can talk about, you've said that climate change is important, and it's going to underscore a lot of your Vision 2050, but I appreciate that you need a tool to weigh up all the different demands that you have. So we want to integrate with Vision 2050 and bring these ideas forward. But we also need, there is me, there is Rob, and there is Miriam. You have a staff of 3 that work on this. And we would definitely want, if you want to continue to develop your plans around this through the 23-24 annual plan, we think you need to think about increasing some funding so that you can either actually start developing, if you have projects that you say that's a go and we want you to do that now, we can start to figure that out, what it's going to look like and how we're going to do that. But we might also need to start writing business cases, because often through the annual plan and the LTP is where your funding goes. So if you have to decide in the last LTP that we're not going to fund something till year 2, that means we're not going to start doing it until year 2. We can't do the work without the resourcing or the staff. So that is the end of my presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. A lot of information in there and a lot of options of how we might move forward in this space. So I'll take questions now. Also, if people in the public gallery would like to make a comment or ask any questions, just come up and press the microphone on the spare table. And we have Councillor Wilson first.
Okay, thanks. I just wonder about some of the assumptions. Just before I get to that, I'm not sure why we are specifically setting emissions targets when there are national guidelines already, and why we aren't just tapping into those. Seems a little bit like reinventing the wheel to me. But of the assumptions, am I correct in assuming that this is all predicated on this 30,000 population growth for Kapiti? Because it seems that seems to be built into everything. I don't even know where that number came from, and I don't know if the previous council ever had a discussion about degrowth as opposed to this assumption that there'll be 30,000 more people here. Sounds like a developer's dream to me, but I'm not sure that's necessarily in the best interest of Kapiti, and policies that could be part of a policy framework anyway. The survey that was referred to, I've never seen it, but I would be interested to see it. Also, we ship a lot of our waste to Horowhenua and Manawatu, so I'm not quite sure how that pans out. And just in a response quickly, when you'd mentioned that the council had applied for funding unsuccessfully, I know comms don't like putting out, bad news stories, but I think it's important to let the public know that we've applied for funding for something and the government has said no, or somebody has said no, and why they've said no. We love putting out the story to say we applied for funding and we've got this funding and da-da-da-da, that's great. But the public don't know that we've applied for funding and been knocked back. Yeah, that'll do for me for now.
I think Brandy has some responses. Thanks.
Just a few. I just wanted to say, and I know Chris would like to speak to it, there is a revised growth projection that, and Hamish, I believe, will be speaking to this afternoon, because the growth projection was made pre-COVID.
Chris, would you like to come round here? Because you seem to have some useful input quite frequently. So.
And while Chris moves on, I would just say one more thing. I will send the link to the survey. It's on our website, so I'll send that out to you.
Want to introduce yourself?
Chris Pivan, GM Strategy and Growth. I think just in response to the question around growth, where it will link back to is the growth strategy. So you had a presentation last week on the urban development projections, which link back to that growth trajectory. And I think as we get into our visioning work for the future, one of the things that I do want to put on the table for you is some ideas of scenarios. So at the moment, the trajectory that we have in place links to the Wellington Regional Leadership Group and the approach that we've agreed to take around how we will collectively and consistency talk about growth in the Wellington region. Also, that aligns to, of course, the national directive that all local authorities need to prepare for growth. So it links back to that. Whether 30,000 is the stable and right number is, of course, up for grabs, and it does move slightly. But the idea was we were putting a punt to the future of what change might look like. And it's true that that could actually sort of move forward in a variety of ways.
Yeah, I think the short answer is a little bit of that is out of our hands. Do you want to stay there if you want to? Yeah. So I've got Councillor Coe next.
Yeah, just some thoughts from me. So one of the things about our district is we have a lot of old people like me. And so the idea of active transport takes on a different perspective, I think, because of that. We have to realise that a lot of our older people actually are not physically capable of being involved in active transport. The other thing on transport is that we are highly dependent on Greater Wellington providing public transport options here. We have to be going back to them and saying we cannot achieve our targets unless you guys deliver. We absolutely have to be beating down their doors and saying where is our public transport? Because I don't believe we can achieve our targets without their input. And while they might have a region-wide target, where does Kapiti fit in that? Maybe all of their efforts are going into Wellington City and not up to here. So it's not necessarily going to be an even distribution. We have to get stroppy with these people and say, right, we want to reduce our emissions. Where's our public transport? In terms of shared transport, I think there are other spin-offs in terms of our tourism, in the sense that we could be saying to people, catch a train up to Kapiti and then jump into a Mevo or onto an electric bike and take a tour of our district, and maybe even link into that some of those sequestration options, because if we're planting native trees, that, as opposed to trees that are going to be harvested, we're going to have, forest lands for people to wander through. Maybe we can do, like natural burials in some of those forests, or, have other reasons why we use those forests, for recreation and all sorts of other things. So there's a spin-off to that. So, and the wetlands as well, becomes another form of tourism attraction. And in terms of, do we have a target? Absolutely, we should have an interim target, because we need to communicate that out to people and say, hey guys, here's our short-term target. If we have a 2050 target, a lot of people are going to say, I'm going to be dead by then. why am I going to bother, you know? So we have to have short-term targets, I think, to alter people's behaviour, because that's what this is all about. And I still come back to the point that I made in my election campaign. I don't know what I need to be doing differently. Every household in Kapiti should have some kind of a leaflet or a place they can go to find out the things that they need to be doing differently now. You know, because their message is just not getting through. So what can we do to equip households with this information about here's the short-term target we've got to meet, here's what you as an individual or as a family need to do to help us get to that target. So, you know, I think it's, you know, we've got to be more proactive, I would say even aggressive, you know, to get in people's faces, into their homes and say, hey guys, we've got a problem here. You know, it's kind of like we're still kind of taking a walk in the park on this stuff, from my perspective. You know, it's a kind of a laid back, oh well, you know, we're doing all these wonderful things, but hey, no, it's more than that. I think there needs to be a lot more energy put into it.
Thanks, Liz. Any response to that? Or no? Just wait for the next microphone to come on.
Oh, hi, thank you.
Hey.
Just following up what Liz was saying around the public transport, and I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but I think council needs to put the pressure on Greater Wellington Regional Council. We've got huge issues for children walk to school. I live opposite a primary school. We need bus shelters so that children can access school safely. At the moment, at some schools, it's not safe for children to get public transport. This council needs to put more footpaths, so there are footpaths on both sides of the roads, because that is also a road safety issue for children walking to school. And I know we've had a conversation with Greater Wellington, and thank you, Sean. I understand that Ron's speaking with one of the school principals, the Jess Ward, who's the chair of the Principals Association around schools. They've got huge issues. And we've had Greater Wellington up here, or whoever it was, and they talk and they go away and nothing ever happens. So I agree with Liz. We need to start putting some pressure on Greater Wellington Regional Council, and they need to pay for it. And older people as well. It's kind of like, you know, we need bus shelters. If we're wanting people to get on, we need bus shelters. Otherwise, I'm not going to stand in the rain and wait for a bus. But also, and I just switch a bit on the development and offcuts from buildings. In the past, many moons ago, house designs, and I don't know with Rob, but house designs were designed to fit in with the length of timber, but now they don't. And that's why you've got more waste from timber, because people want their big fancy houses and they don't comply with. So maybe get the architects to go back to drawing designs that fit the length of timber. But that's what I want to say. But I think this council should put pressure on Greater Wellington Regional Council to front up and sort it out for especially for our children at school and our older people, so they can walk and scooter to school. And since COVID, where I live opposite the school, there was twice as many people taking their children to school by vehicles than what there was prior COVID. Because they're banked up. I'm down the end of the cul-de-sac and they're banked up outside my house now on a sunny day. That's all.
Yeah, just to answer that, Greater Wellington, just a little bit. One long-term plan, I think it was the last one. We actually 5 councillors went to submit to the Greater Wellington Regional Council long-term plan. We do put pressure on, but we need to make sure we keep that up. And yeah, I'll certainly be having conversations around that. They did recently double the buses in Otaki, so there is some work going on, but yeah, certainly much more could be going on. They also come and talk to our youth council and other organisations, but yeah, certainly that's a top priority, is making sure that we have as much public transport as we can. Simon, thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, thank you, Brandy, for your report. That's excellent. I'd like to focus on a couple of areas. One is about more quantification. I don't think we can actually really prioritise things unless we understand a bit more of how much of a bang for buck or actual points of impossibility. You know, when I'm looking at, let's say, transport, we're all focusing on transport, and it might be impossible to actually reduce our emissions to a certain level. It might be impossible to actually, at this current infrastructure, the current spread, the current population, impossible to go past 40%, let's say, for example. So instead of focusing on reduction, what are we doing at looking at sequestration and things of actually alternatives? So let's say look at, and also this ties in with what can we actually affect locally versus globally. From certain reports I've heard that EVs are actually worse for the environment than petrol in the long term. What are we doing to actually advocate for, let's say, hydrogen and alternatives? So we've got the LPG infrastructure up and down the country. We can actually start to convert to other alternative methods of fuel that can be developed in this country. So that's kind of like a central government initiative, I believe. But what is our limits? I've heard from other research that wetland sequestration could exceed forests by 30 to 50%. So I think in Otaki there's a stretch of land which was in a Māori trust there, Iwi Trust there, which they've decided, that's in Tasman Road, and they've decided to actually eliminate having pastures there. And they're deciding what to do with that land, and I think they're actually erring towards wetlands again. And so partnering, let's say, with private or trusts and actually looking at how we can actually sequester, because it's going to be impossible for us to reduce emissions to zero. We need to think about the other side of the balance as well and say, well, what are the things we can actually offset our sequestration and to make sure we're zero overall, because I think we're too heavily involved in reducing limits or reducing emissions, where I think there's a lot of impossibilities there. And so I think we need to do a bit more research on where is our bang for buck and what can we do alternatively, and then we can actually make proper decisions here.
Yeah, that's the second time that cost-benefit kind of question has arisen today. So, yeah, good point.
Thank you.
Looking around for the red light.
Oh, I think
Sophie.
it's me. Cool. Kia ora, Brandy and Ninka, back at the table for a second session today. And thanks for bringing this information back to especially the new councillors, because it is good to make sure we're all across it, as it's something that through our strategic prioritisation corridor as a council table, climate action and addressing the climate crisis, delivering on our climate emergency declaration has been continuously coming out as number one or number two within those conversations. So just to remind fellow elected members that that's been the conversation, and I look forward to us kind of uncovering how we can go further and faster on this mahi through both our target setting, but then also what lies behind that, and what lies behind that being incredibly crucial, both connecting with our visioning mahi, but also our kind of plan or strategy to get us to the target that we want to reach. Now, obviously there is that kind of 2050, and going back to what Councillor Wilson was saying around that almost being a given, because it's already out there as something to strive for if we want to be in with a chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. But ultimately I don't think that's far enough or fast enough at all. And again, if we think about our responsibility to the next generation, I think if we're just falling back on a target that's been widely adopted, are we really kind of pushing ourselves and showing the leadership that I think our community is really up for seeing? So I would encourage us to consider going with a similar approach to what Christchurch has done, setting a net zero target of 2045 and an intermediary target of 2030 and seeing a 50% reduction by then. And then I think too, what Councillor Coe was saying around going to Greater Wellington and having those conversations with central government to say, we're really willing actually to prioritise action, and we're doing that through setting a really ambitious target, through prioritising it through our annual plans, our long-term plans, and so you've got to come to the table. I think it gives us more leverage if we are ambitious to actually get some action out of those other players who we really need buy-in from and we need to partner with. So I would say that potentially could really help us in those conversations. In terms of the vision for 2050 work, I think this needs to underscore everything within that mahi, not only elements of it. We're seeing that frameworks like the kind of donut economics model and also the Te Ao Māori kind of view of that kind of coming to the fore, which is really exciting, and those concepts around degrowth. I think the conversation just has to shift, and if we can all kind of start to do that in our own roles around the table, but also in the community, then I think some really exciting things could definitely be afoot. And I come back to also the climate emergency declaration that we made. I was here in 2019, not around the table, but in the public gallery when that declaration was made, and feeling the massive amounts of momentum that the school strikers had created, that, you know, low carbon Kapiti had been a part of mobilising and creating, and that then led us to making a bold decision. And I feel like we're very much at the point now where, yeah, we can't really wait for that. I mean, it's coming back. There's a school strike this Friday, so be there, 2 p.m. Civic Square, and there's people kind of getting out and rallying, and we've got an awesome show of public participation here, but we need to lead, and we need to recognise that, yeah, our community will come on board. And I think if we start showing that we're really here to have those hard conversations and thump the table a little bit, then I think our community might be quite excited, because we're getting involved and we're trying to create really awesome outcomes for them that not only address our climate challenges, but also intersectionally address our housing, our transport challenges, our community wellbeing, our connectedness challenges. We can do all of those things at once. So I don't necessarily think the conversation around trade-offs is a particularly helpful one, because I think there are ways that we can, through what we're prioritising, address a whole bunch of things at once. And so the more we talk about that kind of interconnected way of seeing the world, which is again a very Te Ao Māori Indigenous way of looking at things, I think the more helpful this conversation will be. But I would just again encourage us to be ambitious and to be aspirational, and to think back to the massive momentum that was felt when we've kind of now gotten to this point, and now continuing with that and not just letting ourselves kind of fall back into the comfortable seat. But yeah, it's going to be far tougher to not act now than to just get it done and start the mahi.
Yeah, certainly that's been supported through our visioning work in terms of our priorities as a council, and I think it's also been supported by what we've been hearing from staff today about the huge amount of work that goes on behind the scenes across the organisation all the time. You don't necessarily feel that every day, but yeah, there's certainly so much going on. I remember that day too. I seconded that motion. So yeah, and as staff said earlier, it was an aspirational target, a very aspirational target at the time, and not based on any kind of council report or reality checks or cost-benefit analysis, but just a statement and a line in the sand that we want to do as much as we can. And I'm hearing that we're ready to do that again, but in a more considered way in with our staff, so that we can actually achieve what we set out to achieve. Councillor Pravanov, Jocelyn.
Thank you. So first of all, I just wanted to follow up on first of all Simon's comment in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, in terms of the having some figures around some of the areas here, so that we can actually make the best decisions for the money that's available. I think I brought that up in the subcommittee meeting that we had, and also in the briefing. So I suppose then, going on to a couple of topics, transport, for example, in Europe, it's just a given that people take public transport regardless of whether they're young or old. And I think, we've talked about education in terms of wanting people to, to use public transport more, and I think there's a lot more work that can be done. But I think somehow we have got to find ways to incentivise people to do that. And then when you look at our public transport system, there's two sort of ways it works. One is actually going directly from people taking a bus directly to public transport. And I think there's lots of people there, my friends included, who don't take a bus when they easily could. The second one is where a person is wanting to go somewhere else. Like, for example, as I mentioned the other day, it would take me 40 minutes to take a bus and a train to come here. That's not including the 10 or 15 minutes it takes for me to walk. And, if we want to encourage people to take public transport, we really need to talk to GW about changing these routes. And I know I mentioned the other day about using the expressway. At 10 to 9 this morning, I was driving down here from Otaki, and there was a 290 bus on the expressway, so they do it, and it had people on it, so they do it. So I think, you know, that is one of the options. It's about making it the routes cheaper, shorter, but also to looking at the fare structure. If people are going into Wellington on the train, having a reduction in fares if they're actually taking two modes of transport. And so then the other thing I wanted to talk about was equestration, and in terms of the difference between trees, between native trees and pine trees. And obviously people are planting pine trees because of the carbon credits, that they get so much more for pine trees than they do for native trees. And I think there has been some conversation around re-looking at that, and I think that really, you know, maybe in this area here that this council puts a remit up to the national, yes, exactly. So in terms of that there, I think there is some, you know, some work that could be done in that area there. And then there's also, you know, looking at the way that we build our, I suppose our, well, it's how we build all these new houses. And, you know, like in Auckland, for example, I know there's a lot of conversation around sponge cities. And here, you know, we've got issues with the hard surfaces. I just looked online that grass is actually a far better system for producing, it's sequestering carbon than what trees are, and also produces more oxygen per area. So I think, you know, that actually feeds into how we plan and build our houses, and basically what some of the stuff that's in our plan is, our district plan, in terms of how we look at things. So just the last point I wanted to make too, that I know it was in one of the very first slides, it talked about the stormwater strategy 2022. Is that on our website? Is a strategy? It says that so the 2022 strategy is actually on the website, or is that work still actually happening?
Parts of it are complete and parts are still under development. The reason why they've changed the name to framework is under the regional, is it the policy statement or the Wellington Regional Plan? Natural Resources Plan, thank you. We're now required to have a stormwater strategy that is approved by Greater Wellington. That is not, they are the ones that approve it. So that is currently being discussed, like there is a draft and we're engaging with Greater Wellington. So there is a framework which explains our general approach to stormwater, but that new strategy will be approved by Greater Wellington. But that's why it will sit under the framework along with everything else.
It's just that it said 2022, which actually
there is a framework for it said framework, I believe.
Okay, so that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Christian.
Kia ora, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the staff for the work and the presentations. A few points, just getting back to the nub of the issue about setting a target. There's a trap here that we could wait for others to act before feeling we have enough information to set a target against. That will never change. So unless we set a target promptly, today would be great, we will not have something to work towards. We will not have something to make us sit down and say, right, how are we going to achieve this? How are we going to bring others on board? If we go down the route of delay, we will never act. And in terms of emissions reductions, we have all of the technologies and changes to things that we can do to do with urban form and the way we live our lives to hand already. They are cost effective. They work elsewhere. We just need to get on with these things, and we need to do that against the target. We do not need to wait for some silver bullet, new technology or newfangled thing, or, oh, I heard this and that, this will save us all. No, we know how to do this. We just need to do it. Other places are doing it as well. We don't need a silver bullet. The cost of not cutting emissions will be truly catastrophic. We have seen all too clearly what's happening in the north of the country right now, the cost in lives, shattered communities that can't be rebuilt or shouldn't be rebuilt, billions of dollars worth of damage to infrastructure that it's going to have to be borne by local ratepayers, because we are not in a position even to cope with what climate change is doing for us today. We must cut emissions. We cannot buy our way out of this problem by emitting and then sequestering carbon. That's not going to be good enough. And the weather we have already locked in for the climate to continue to get worse, and for extreme weather events to become both more frequent and severe. This is a very well-established pattern that's playing out. And what I do in my day job, I can see the dollars that are directly attached to this. This is real. There is an awful lot that we can do within our gift as council. When there's a new development, we should be encouraging passive neighbourhoods that don't add to net energy consumptions. You can build passive houses. You can build them that don't have direct use of fossil fuels in the home. You can build them that don't rely on cars, etc., and transport. Our community, our district is ideally suited for most of the population, not all, but most of the population, to live in 15-minute low-carbon communities. We can do this. We can enable that through our actions as council, through our planning. We can incentivise that through the way we charge for consents, etc. We can work with the community to reduce stationary energy emissions and get them off gas, etc., and using sort of diesel for stationary energy, or fuel oil, or LPG, or whatever it is. Cost-effective technologies exist out there today that the rest of the world use, and much of the rest of the community already does use, to address these issues. When it comes to public transport, we're going to have to continue to advocate with others, and we need to use our target that should be aligned with Greater Wellington's target as a stick to beat them with, to get them to help to achieve our mutual targets for the whole country. I think that's it from me.
Thanks, Christian. I'm going to go to Councillor Halliday next, because Simon's already had a go.
Look, I agree with everything that's been said here. I just had a couple of points that I just wanted to add into the mix. Not saying I disagree with anything at all on the urgency around all this, but I do, and correct me if I'm wrong, we already partner obviously on a regional level with, there's regional forums with regards to addressing this, but I do wonder whether we should be building relationships with our neighbours as well with regards to, you know, if everyone's got small teams in this space, and how we can use those teams as multipliers with regards to a lot of this work that's being done, rather than necessarily reinventing the wheels ourselves. As such, I think that's really, really important. And I'm just going to hark back to an underlying issue, is that, you know, we can talk about all this, but fundamentally, you know, local government's just not funded fit for purpose to deal with these sorts of issues. We all know the things that need to be done, but we can only, as is seen by the size of our team, we can only implement so much based on our rates take. So I just, again, I do often keep harking back to this. Local government funding is not fit for purpose, and we need to really be pushing hard. This is an ongoing thing. This is not an immediate silver bullet by any stretch of the imagination, but part of the equation is local does need no local. We're going through local government reform, and how we are funded to address this is going to be critical as well. We can't be expected to keep rating for these sorts of things. There has to be central money that comes back to local government to be spent locally to address these huge local issues tying into with a national direction. I'll leave it at that, but I think that's crucial with regards to how we do things as well, because we can only do so much. We can try all the things in the world, but we've got to get community buy-in as well. And you know, there's no going back. There's only going forward. You know, and everything that was being said here is, all of it is important. How we do business, the changes that we need to make, all of it crucially important. But dollars do need to come from somewhere as well to make all this work happen.
Completely agree. Central government seems to be able to step in a crisis, but not so much the rest of the time. And that certainly forms a strong part of, I think, all the submissions to the future of local government across the country, is that the funding mechanism for local government just isn't fit for purpose.
And look, I just referred to Sean Mallon before. You know, we're ahead of the game with regards to a lot of our planning. We stepped into this. You know, this has taken a reallocation of our assets to do this. So it has taken money away from other things, but it has, but it has meant that we're able to get on top of it. But other councils, I don't know. It's just funding's always an issue.
Thanks, Simon.
Look, thank you very much for allowing me to have a second bite of the cherry, Madam Chair. Look, I'd just like to reiterate the sentiments that Sophie and Liz have put forward, and also Martin and Christian. We need to look at changing our own behaviours. Global warming is a global problem, and Kapiti itself cannot solve this. What we need to do, in my perspective, is actually look at other aspects that affect the global warming. Let's say like consumerism, reducing our consumerism. Let's say light bulbs and LEDs. They're built in obsolescence to make other countries rich. We need to actually demand higher quality products. Maybe look at New Zealand-based products of things we actually can affect in New Zealand with standards. And how about food miles? Where do we get our food from? Perhaps we should have a local plant-based diet, because that's the best way for sustainability, right? You don't have to travel far to get a broccoli to my house, but all the tuna in this country comes from Thailand. So I completely agree that we need to do a lot more about changing our personal behaviours. For me, let's say I've got a small little red rubbish bin that gets collected every 2 weeks, and I think I put it out 4 weeks ago, and there's still nothing in there. So we can make personal changes, and I believe that we probably need to advocate that ourselves. Things like, actually, I have to travel here. I don't have a train to get from Kapiti, from Otaki, so I actually have to take my car here. I'd love to be able to interact like this online. I wouldn't have to travel. So other initiatives outside the box than just the ones which are basically put in front of us, I'd like us to look at further abroad. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks, Simon. Nigel?
Yeah, just very quickly, I'm conscious of the fact that we've got people like Deirdre, who was fundamental in getting transition towns going back in the day. This is way back ahead of everybody. And Olga and Sarah and Paul, is there an opportunity? I mean, these people are experts in their field. It'd be fabulous to hear from them.
Yeah, well,
assuming
the opportunity's been there the whole time. But yeah, I was going to come to that next, actually. You just beat me to it. So cool. No more lights around the table. Just press the button on the right and the light should come on.
Thank you. On transport, I would really like to see car sharing, because I just think that's, I live in a retirement village and we've all got cars and we all go out separately, and, it's a big effort. But if Mevo could be, if you could liaise with Mevo, it would be hugely beneficial for us. On waste, I was a member of the waste task force. We met for 7 months. We produced a huge report. It was buried at Christmas time, and then came COVID, and it's not even on the council website now. So food waste is a really big issue that could be dealt with quite easily, quite cheaply. So I urge you to do that. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm surprised. I'm surprised that's not on the website.
No,
yeah.
It is published on our website in the meeting minutes of 13 December 2019, and we have done a very intensive Love Your Compost campaign in the past 3 years as a result of the recommendations of that report, one of the actions that we've taken up.
That's good to hear. Yeah, and maybe it needs to be published separately outside the agenda on the website so that it's easier to find. Thanks for all the work the task force. Thanks for all the work that task force did. I think Councillor Handford was quite involved with that as well. A huge commitment by that group of people, and the report's absolutely fabulous. So good to hear we're taking up some of the actions. It might be good to have another look at it and just make sure that we're implementing as much of that report as we can. Sarah?
Thank you, everyone. And there's a lot I could say, and I'll limit myself. But firstly, just acknowledging all of your work, and none of this is easy. And Brandy, thanks so much for your presentation. It was great to be here. I just have a really simple question, really, and that is like there are so many components to this, and there are so many good responses that everyone has mentioned. Is there an overarching strategy for district-wide emissions reductions? Because it needs to be a strategic plan forward for encompassing everything, right?
They're fighting over answering your question, Sarah.
That's a great question, and there is it's in the plans. So this training, as we're starting to do visioning work, one of the key aspects of that is going to be a climate strategy and thinking about how this comes together from a district-wide perspective, and the priorities for which we'd be starting to engage with the community more widely.
There's got to be so many pathways that come together, and strategic planning, this is going to be the only way to really make action and changes. And I think, what you said as well, Councillor Coe, about having behavioural change is excellent. Other regions, the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, have got a resource for their community, so I would really urge you not to reinvent the wheel. There's that resource available. They've made it, available for other councils to replicate free of charge. So really encourage you to do that as well. And just in terms of housing, I just wanted to mention one other thing, which is, we see the disasters in other regions now, and things are only going to get worse. And having a, really creative solution to some of these things may mean changing bylaws, like for tiny houses that have, lower impact, both in terms of consumption, but also are using less resources and potentially movable. So really encourage council to think a little bit more creatively in that space as well. I'll limit myself. There's lots.
Sorry, stay there, because I think Brandy has another response to your previous question.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to say one thing. In my mind, there is a distinction between the different strategies, and that's what I was trying to convey from the start. Do we have a district-wide emission reduction strategy? The answer is clearly no. Right. Does that mean we don't have different programs of work? We do. We have transport programs of work. We have waste, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, it has not been put on the strategy program yet, and that's what I was trying to explain. Our focus has been on originally organizational emissions reduction and adaptation and protecting our assets. So we understand that a district-wide emissions reduction strategy is needed, but once again, limited resources. Like, I absolutely appreciate the suggestions, but there's only 3 of us. So now that we have a strategy team, they're going to pick that up, I believe. Yeah. But we have not been funded to do that to date. So that is the difference, and that's why we're here today to talk to them about where they want to go with that. I see people smiling. Did I say something funny?
No. We're just happy. We're just happy that we're going to have one.
And I guess from the community that I represent, I'm talking to young families who've got children who are going to be growing up into a future that is climate disrupted. And I urge you strongly to reprioritize. Funding is always going to be an issue. It's about prioritization, right?
And that is for the councillors to hear, and through the long-term plan.
So, Sophie, would you like to make a comment on that? Because you've been leading some of our, strategy and operations program.
Yeah, sure, happy to. So we just had a bit of a workshop as a council table only, was it last week, where we were kind of going through kind of strategic prioritisation ahead of kind of the time-bound annual plan and long-term planning kind of moments, where often we get to those conversations and we haven't had the chance to, before that, really sit down and go, what are our strategic priorities as a table? How do we see those kind of as fitting into the kind of broader planning process that we're legislated to do? Yes. And some of the things that we're kind of still yet to work through, but that have been coming up continuously in those conversations, are around land use. So that 15-minute neighbourhood kind of concept and the connectedness of those across the district. What does good growth look like? But then even further to that, or potentially different to that, what is the kind of degrowth concept, and how do we reconcile the strategies that we've already got with potentially a change in, or a pivot in language and a pivot in approach? And so all of those sorts of things ahead of our more formal planning processes are things that councillors really want to revisit. There's been a bit of kōrero too about inland flooding, ponding, stormwater, infrastructure, all of those sorts of things. Central government direction, our district plan, intensification, how that fits in with the need to, again, pivot how we house people to ensure that, we're kind of building resilience in two ways. So we're building resilience as we find ourselves in the midst more frequently now of climate disasters, but we're also building resilience in the sense that, we're building low carbon communities. So all of those sorts of things, that's why I was kind of urging councillors to remember those conversations that we've been having, so that throughout, these next few weeks and few months, that whole reprioritisation conversation continues to be. Yeah, totally. So what will kind of underpin this will be a strategy to deliver on it. So that's the goal anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. I think that's really good to have that broader context. And I think what we're doing today is we're putting down the first building blocks for exactly that. So, So I think what I'm hearing is we should proceed with that work with some urgency from your point of view. And judging by what we've been saying as a council so far, I think we all agree. I'll go to Paul now.
Thank you, and thanks for all the conversations today. I've got two very unpopular suggestions, but they're big ones, and one's to do with roading. I think the council should lobby NZTA and the government to cancel the Otaki to Live-In Expressway. I think it should be promoting safety improvements all that way along, but that's $1.5 billion that will be better used to support trains, for example, to Palmerston North. We should have regular trains to Palmerston and on to Wanganui. We could take the trains right to Palmerston North Airport. So my second unpopular one is that I think the council should actively work with the Templeton Group and iwi to close the airport and to build 3,000 houses, high-density houses, on reasonably unfloodable land. And it's close to the centre. We should work with Templeton to say that they don't need cars in every house, and we could bike, walk, bus to the station, to coastlands and such like. So those are my two unpopular plans.
I agree with one of them and not with the other, and I won't tell you which is which.
I've just been listening to the conversation. I just wanted to reflect back on this discussion around targets versus actions and council's role and what's within council's ability to change and what you can do and so on. I guess to me, when I think of a district-wide target, it's just a recognition of the reality of what needs to happen in the world. Fossil fuel emissions need to go to zero globally. And Kapiti needs to do that too. It's not like, it's too hard for us, so someone else will find it easier. Everyone actually has to do this everywhere, and it's really hard and it's really daunting, and we're all going to have to do it in quite a short space of time. It is achievable. International organisations have mapped out pathways globally of, all the technology change and so on. But then, so to me, the setting the deep targets is just, it becomes like a guide star kind of what is it that needs to happen? And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes under it of how do you put stuff together to try and get there, to that place that we need to get to. So then you get to the role of council and, under-resourced small councils, I know. And I agree absolutely that you need to be very careful about how you prioritise very scarce resources, particularly in terms of your staff. Don't burn them out, please. But the good news is that a lot of the things that I've seen on the chart are actually not things that you need to do. I mean, the electricity emissions, they're going to come down as grid electricity intensity comes down. The vehicle fleet is mostly a central government responsibility. So it's okay to have a plan with deep productions that's got looming gaps in it that require others to follow through with what they've said they're going to do, or even to strengthen what they've said that they're going to do. And you can be advocates for that. Just think of the target as the where we need to get to. And then so then it's like, well, what is council's role? Well, it's in the things that you do have control over. And as long as there is that strategic plan that we've just heard about and talked about, you can identify like what is it that's within your control and you need to be doing. A lot of that is the things that we've heard around mainstreaming into all of council's programs and decisions. So economic development strategy, land use planning, those are the things that are really going to matter. And when you think about that guiding star of the targets, what does an actual Kapiti community look like that uses no fossil fuels, like zero? What does that look like? And are the decisions that you are taking today around economic development and land use planning taking us in that direction, or are they standing in the way of it? And that's where targets to me can help, because they give you kind of that like really clear kind of that clarity around what you're actually trying to achieve. And it becomes as much about not so much what you do, like do we want to fund this, recycling program or that, this or that. It becomes a lot about what you don't do, and that's something I think that, is very much in your control. So good luck.
So yeah, first up, thank you so much for the presentation. I'd be very happy if this was my presentation. That was very well done. And probably particularly great that you are bringing things to life. How many cars do we need to be taking off the road? How many light bulbs we need to be changing? That makes it very real. And as previous speakers said, this is, something that helps paint the picture of what this Kapiti need to look like with 3,000 cars less on the road or whatever. I was writing a little list, and then I've got number 0 is urgency, which sits above everything. So yes, I've got a big yes here, urgency, yes, set a target, and yes, 2050 is too far away, because a lot of us by then will be very old or dead. We need to make it something that we can see and see the steps, therefore strategy, really important. I just wanted to give a shout to Liz and her idea to reach out to households. In my sort of day-to-day zero waste work, I see a lot of households that engage with the topic, and I think it won't be very difficult to spread information or engage and tell people how to do certain things, or even ask them how they're doing it. A lot of sharing, that you don't have to share cars to say, oh, I've grown a fantastic patch of broccoli, here's how to do it. There's a lot of that already happening, so things like crop swaps. The discussion that happens in between those events on public forums, and Facebook is a great example of that. It's phenomenal, we just need to support that. I echo the comment about road safety and making sure that infrastructure is fit for, I will never get on a bike in New Zealand. My friend yesterday spent a day in hospital after a trip to work. So unless we create things safe for kids and safe for adults, I think that's very dangerous. And there's a lot you can do, just injecting a dose of positivity, I guess, and whatever you do. There's already things that are happening. You don't need to do everything. I paid a visit to check up on my friends at Zero Waste Otaki, the construction waste, recycling and repurposing site in Otaki landfill. They are open twice a week. And their average volunteer numbers for every day that they're open is 10 volunteers. For Otaki, that's phenomenal. And you will see that there's a lot of community uptake for things if we support them and give them a pat in the back. So there's not a lot that you need to actually fund to make things happen. And my last point is, someone clever put this chart on your screens. When I ran my first zero waste workshop 5 years ago, I had 4 people turn up. You have the opinions of 606 people in there. Use that as your starting point. That's actually really valid information in there. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So I think that's the end of our questions and comments. I think Brandy has some questions she wants to ask us now.
Yeah, 1 comment and 2 questions. I did just want to say, when I send out, some of you haven't seen the survey results, when I send that link out to you, it's on our website. This is one of the questions that we asked: how important is it for council to focus on each of the following areas as a way of contributing to reducing emissions. And I can see that it's very fine print. So I appreciate that you can't all read it, but I will send it to you. But the areas where the community wanted to see the biggest focus, and I brought this up following what Councillor Spears was saying about, where should we focus? How do we make decisions? Advocate for central and regional government to improve public transport was number one in terms of very important and somewhat important. Improve transport infrastructure to enable walking, cycling, public transport, and electric vehicles. And use land use planning to create neighborhoods. Those are the three that were the top. But I mean, of course, there's lots of great ideas, and it doesn't mean that we don't do the others, but those are three areas. And it is very difficult. I forgot to say that in the last triennium, the councillors had asked us to get expert advice around this. And it's really difficult to measure and have a value for money kind of discussion around some of these activities because of the uptake. So we can certainly tell you how many more kilometers of footpaths or bike lanes have been built, but that doesn't tell us if people are going to take them up. There are other indicators that we can look at, like the census data or traffic cams and traffic counts, to see if those are being picked up. And there's some interesting conversations going on right now between the growth team, the growth strategy type team, and the transport team to talk about where do we focus our limited resources, what are the most important areas, how do we use that data better. So those discussions are taking place, but it can be very hard for us to say with something like this. It's different than with corporate emissions, where we can say, if you purchase a solar panel of this size, you will get X amount of emissions reductions, because a lot of it is about uptake and behavior change. So that's one reason why I added this, just get the public giving a sense of some of the areas they were most interested in. So just thought I'd throw that out. Coming back to our final two slides, I have heard several people say we would like to see a target. I've heard one person say we would like to see a target like Christchurch that's more ambitious. I've heard people say we need to have a short-term target so that we can start to use it and talk about it. But I have been hearing mixed feedback, and unfortunately, Christian, we cannot make a decision in a workshop, so it has to come back to you through a council report, because that's the way your governance structures and delegations work. So I'd really like to know where you all stand. I can't get a collective sense of, do you want a target? And if so, what might it be? So I see a few hands up, but I didn't see many.
First of all, who doesn't want a target? I dare you to raise your hand. Exactly. I think we all agree with you. I said, if you don't want a target, I dare you to raise your hand. So I think that's a given. Yeah, that's a given. So the next question is, what target or targets are we thinking at the moment that we want to aim for? So what have we got on the screen there? Brandy, can you take us through?
What we currently have proposed for 2050 is just the standard Climate Change Response Act, net zero by 2050. Sophie also mentioned that Christchurch had net zero by 2045. Dunedin's done net zero by 2040. We know they are revisiting those, but yeah, you would have a 2050 target and potentially an interim. Porua does not have an interim, but you've argued about why you think an interim is important. So we actually, and this is one thing I'm trying to convey, we're trying to help you make evidence-based decisions as best we can, but you, our council, you make all these decisions about direction, targets, and whatnot.
Yeah, so one thing I pointed out in the when we had this conversation this morning, touched on this morning, is that I think we should focus on what we can achieve by 2030. Make that like a target. You know, who said it has to be an interim target? Our first targets are global emissions cut 50% by 2030, 40% increase in walking, cycling, 35% reduction in emissions from land. So the first question I'd like to ask is, do councillors think that's going far enough by 2030? Nigel?
my own view is that we should be setting very ambitious
Feel free to
targets.
disagree too.
Targets, by their very nature, aspirational. Yeah, like you don't get shot if you don't get your target, right? But I don't think we should be aiming at unambitious targets. I think you aim at ambitious targets. I mean, there's got to be a degree of realism in there, obviously, but that gets found out in the process of trying to reach your target, right? But I think we should be as aspirational as possible when we set targets.
That was exactly the thinking when we set the 2025 target. The question is how aspirational. How do we want to balance aspiration with realism? Where do we want to strike that balance? I think.
If we look at there is an example, a concrete example that was mentioned in Christchurch. Do we think they're all on drugs, or do we think that's not a bad idea? If we think that's not a bad idea, well, there's a starting point.
Maybe that's easier to go there first. So let's see who would like to follow Sophie's suggestion of aiming for that zero reduction by 2045. Maybe can we have a show of hands? Yep. Okay, do you want to make a comment, Sophie? So I'll go to Sophie next. I'll work my way around, don't worry.
Yeah, just to emphasise too the points that were made around it being crucial that any form of a target, whether it's aspirational or not, but fully believing that it should be aspirational and ambitious. So if we wanted to go completely aspirational and ambitious, I'd say 2040, but I feel like 2045 is potentially a good balance between the two to ensure that we have a really kind of strong strategy that can really help us to achieve that. And so just again, adding that into the conversation, that has been something that's been kind of continuously brought up as the need for something that ties all of the strands together, and to demonstrate that both to the community but also to the wider organisation that is a strategy to get there. So in terms of the 2030 target, I know we talked about that kind of WWF potential model for generating a 2030 target, and I think we were even looking at, was it 56 or 57% reduction by 2030. So I would be potentially keen for that combination, a 57% reduction by 2030 and then net zero 2045.
Thanks. Christian.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What's the relationship between what the science tells us we must do to keep a livable planet that's not going to get smashed like we're seeing at the moment, and the numbers that we've got up on the slides? Are they a product of that, or are they just, that's what other people are doing, off we go?
The global emissions cut by 50% by 2030 is the Glasgow Climate Pact part of that target.
Right.
Thanks, Christian.
So is all that consistent with that? So when you're talking about 40% increase in walking, cycling and public transport use, that would be X tons of emissions reductions, and is that consistent with staying no more than 1.5?
From what I understand from Greater Wellington Regional Council, they did not do the analysis. They set some targets. So I don't know. I haven't done any analysis to indicate that.
Is there a rule of thumb for a science-based target to say what you need to do to?
Are you setting science-based targets?
Yeah.
Thanks, Christian. Martin?
I'm going to be a little bit controversial. Two things on my end. First of all, we're little old New Zealand. I can't see any issue with aligning ourselves with international guidelines. I dare say those guidelines will change over time. They might get tighter, they might expand, I don't know. But we can be aspirational in our own way. But what we have to take into consideration is this, again, all costs. So it's all very well and fine setting big, large targets. But if we're unrealistic in how, one, they're going to be resourced, or how we're going to get there, this comes back to the strategy, how do we get there, then it's a moot point. because there's no point in bankrupting us as a council, although one would argue that who cares, because at the end of the day, if we don't sort the climate out, what's the point? But, you know, we, I hate to say it, we do have competing obligations as such. But we do have to be aspirational, but we do need to do it in a strategic way. And there's lots of low-hanging fruit potentially as well, not necessarily from an emissions perspective, but certainly from bringing the community with us, getting information out there. There's lots of things that we can do there in that respect as well. My other thing is, what's the baseline here? Look, did I hear that the baseline was based around 2005 for the international targets, yet Auckland is doing it from 2020 and Christchurch from about 2016. So it's all very well and fine. It's a bit like our fisheries. If you've got a moving target that's your baseline, you know, it's not getting serious results. I mean, if we've got to reduce a baseline from 2005, there's no point in having it increased by 15 years or 20 years and then saying that's the new baseline and let's cut that by half. We have to cut by emissions by 2005. So we have to be very, very clear on where the baseline sits and that it is so that we are gearing our goals, if you like, to what needs to be done.
We have district-wide emissions data. Like I said, the way that it has been established, you could argue that, you know, it's not the most robust, but it goes back to 2001. Because in the Wellington region, the most recent assessment, there is an assessment being taking place this year, but the most recent published assessment wasn't published in 2020, your 2018-19 data, which is why Wellington City Council is now using that. But that's what I was trying to suggest. By Wellington City Council saying 50% by based on their 2020 baseline, they've raised the bar even higher, absolutely. And that is a point of discussion. I had just assumed that you would probably want to use your most recent baseline, but it does make it harder. And as Ninka is saying, you could go back to be aligned with the the international science-based and how they've picked, I can't remember, is it 2005, I think is the base, or is it 2010? I can pull it up right now.
Yeah, sorry, how does it make it harder? I would have thought that more recent baseline would make it easier. If you go back, if we've been increasing our emissions since 2005, if we go back to 2005 and say we've got to go half of that, that's going to be, if you start your emissions up, you know, if you start...
You've got to have lower emissions if you go back further. I'm quite... Yeah, no. I think if you pull up the slide, it'll be easier. But Liz, we'll go to Liz in the meantime while she does that.
I'm just curious. Look, I just want to say that to me, you've got to have an aspirational target because that's what you need in order to change behaviour. And we can use that to then go back to Greater Wellington and central government to say this is a community that cares, you know, that wants to take an aggressive approach to these problems. So yeah, it absolutely needs to be aspirational. In terms of the cost, I think there's a hang of a lot of stuff that we can do that doesn't cost an awful lot, because at the end of the day, we want to change behaviour. That's about communication, just getting the message through. And, you know, getting Greater Wellington to improve our transport up here is not necessarily going to cost us a lot, other than time and frustration getting them to do it. But there's a hang lot of things we can do that are quite low cost. We don't have to launch into buying up land and planting trees and stuff immediately. So, yeah, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. So let's just be really aspirational and send a clear message and position ourselves as a community that does care about the climate, and we will hopefully attract the kind of people into our area who have those same values and beliefs as well, and that will make it a lot easier.
Thanks, Liz. I'll go back to that, but first of all, we'll go back to Martin's.
It is 2005 for the nationally determined contribution.
Do you want to turn your microphone on?
Oh, sorry. I'm not sure if you can see the font, if it's too tiny. For the Glasgow Climate Pact, that's the highest one. Global emissions cut 50% by 2030. I actually didn't make a note there. Someone else in the audience probably knows what that baseline is. I would nationally determined contributions, 50% reduction of net emissions below our gross 2005 level by 2030. the Climate Change Response Act, net zero GHG emissions by 2050, so net zero. And then biogenic methane's cut 20 to 47% below 2017 by 2050, 10% by 2030.
And that third one, that's what most councils are doing?
For
So
their
that-
largest target, their 2050 target.
So that would enable us to benchmark ourselves against other councils too. So I'd be erring on the side of sticking to that. Do other people agree? I'm getting some nods. Anybody vehemently disagree? The baseline of 2017 rather than the international one, so that we can be aligned with other councils. Rob? Oh no, then we're going to go to Liz's comment about being aspirational. So Sophie had suggested can we go back to the last slide?
About the
57%. Is that?
Oh, yes.
So we have two suggestions so far. One of which we've agreed to, which is bringing that 2050 date forward to 2045. Is that sufficient? Yeah. And then I think it's in the global emissions cut by 57%. Is that what you were suggesting, Sophie?
Well,
was I right?
Wellington City Council has
Microphone, please.
Sorry. Wellington City Council has used a One Planet tool that considers the Human Development Index for each country, and that's how they've chosen 57% by 2030. So it's more ambitious than the 50% by 2030 because they feel that we have a higher Human Development Index, that we are in a better position to do more.
And do you think the Human Development Index would be similar on the Kapiti Coast to Wellington?
Well, it's a national, so we measure it nationally. What is interesting is if you wanted to look, and we talked about this when we did the briefing, in terms of a lot of it is based on deprivation levels, and you do have wide-ranging deprivation levels across the coast. So not to say Wellington City doesn't, they do too, but overall, their average level of deprivation is higher than yours.
Their deprivation is higher.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The lower, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, my mind's a jumble.
Okay, we'll park that for now. Rob?
Yeah, I just have a question here. When you're talking about targets and emissions, you rely heavily on the population, don't you? Now, government, how dare they, have deemed that we're going to have 30,000 people flock to the coast in a certain time. Is that right? And that's what you're basing it on? Well, how can you base a target on something that you don't know when what the population's going to be?
I have nothing to do with it. Yeah, I have not calculated what you can imagine, unless we can reduce emissions per capita, as your population grows, you will continue to have higher emissions. So you're actually going to have to reduce more in the future, if that makes sense.
Right.
And I haven't actually given any thought to that. There is a difference between, Chris and her team could speak to this in more detail, but most of the growth in Kapiti is migration from other parts of the country. It is likely that you will continue to have that. So a very important part of your conversation has to be, how do you grow as sustainably as possible? That's different than, and as Chris said, they picked a high number just to prepare and plan, just in case. Yeah. But it is still sustainable growth, and land use planning is incredibly important. Incredibly important.
I agree entirely. Land use planning is number one, and we have government deeming, a high population growth, which is triggering off developers looking for sacred open spaces like Papram Airport and being reckless with their developments, in my view, on the basis that we're going to have a heck of a lot of people, which I don't think we will, personally, in my opinion. And I think it's incredibly unfair to give us that misleading sort of lead of population numbers that we are working to. And I just register that, and I hope that our targets aren't being unreasonably high. And what I would suggest is we have a shorter period of time and we take a running check of how the population is growing and how the council is expanding to service this. Perhaps a five-yearly standard period that we just have a check and check on the next 5 years. Does that make sense?
We do that kind of thing, and so that'll be something we could talk about in the briefings this afternoon. While I'm mentioning the briefings this afternoon, I've let staff know that we'll be starting them at 2:00, so I'd like to finish up with this one at 1:30 if possible, or 25 to, so that we can fit in some conversations around housing this afternoon. Jackie.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. Looking at the last column there, I can't see any reason under the sun why we couldn't increase the aspirations for the biogenic methane emissions. What is standing in the way? We have a solid waste management and minimisation bylaw 2020 that is a completely adaptable document. It's living. You guys can bring in a bylaw change to the table at any time, vote it in, and change any part of that bylaw to change public action. We have agriculture reducing in the area, so their emissions are reducing anyway. But when it comes to people and what we do with food waste and green waste, we worked so hard in the Mural Task Force on Waste Minimisation, all of us, to ensure that you had every tool available at the table, and you have. So that's just my comment on that. On the actual figures, the 47% by 2033, I'm trying to think about how that message looks when it's given to the public, and to me it's a little bit furry around the edges. I like the idea of a clean cut countdown, 2023 to 2033, to reduce the emissions 50% over 10 years as a public message. That's all I'm saying, as a public message, and a way to get that into the community's thinking is what I would go if it was up to me. But I do love the idea of being very, very aspirational and support that.
Appropriate that you're commenting on waste with so many years of advocating on that issue around this table. Thanks, Jackie. Jocelyn?
Yeah, through you. I have a question. So in terms of the transport emissions, the figure that has been bandied around, does that solely relate to people who live here, or is it actually people who use our districts, for example, the expressways, particularly in a long weekend?
It's actually quite complicated, but in a general level, and this is what I meant with these estimates, they can look at transport usage across the region and then apportion it per capita into the various districts. Yeah. But we can also pull data on gasoline sales in our district, where those residents live. We can get that data from Market View. We haven't to date. We can also look at EV car ownership and car registration. So there are things we could do to make it a little more nuanced, but for the most part, it's based on regional data, and they allocate it per population, and that means it's beyond. It's a whole mess of things mixed together.
Okay, thank you for that. So, I think that we should go for an aspirational figure, but I also think it would be really useful to have some milestones, and then it ensures that we are keeping check to see whether we're on track or not. And also too, within each of that, there are a number of strands that we're going to be looking at to reducing, and I think for the public, it's actually far better to be able to, for them to visualise what some of those key areas are that we want to, that we're actually going to be working on, and so they can actually see what the figures are as well there. So, yeah, that's my input. Thank you.
Yes,
me. Just one comment on the population question. If you're going to zero in 2050, that's also zero per capita. So there's, even if your population's doubled, you've still got to get to zero. And so, yes, you could potentially take some account of it in the interim milestones, but you've got to not get distracted by it, because you've still got to get to zero, even if you've got a bigger population, which makes it harder, absolutely, but you've still got to do it. But what I actually came up to say was that I found this slide actually quite confusing, because it looked as if the targets there in transport waste were ones that were being proposed as 2030 targets potentially, whereas they seem like more sub-sectoral pieces that would sit underneath a 2030, an overall 2030 target, which I think is what I hear you actually talking about. So you need to look at overall where do we need to be in 2030, and then how do all these pieces fit within that.
Yeah. So potentially it needs to be above with the other two coming from that.
That's right.
Yeah, that would be clearer. It took me a minute to work out the slide too. We'll work on that. So I'll go through what I've been.
Question?
Oh yeah, sure,
Sorry,
Sarah.
just a really
Sorry.
quick question. Just from a general public perspective, having a target is great. How soon could we expect a strategy again? You know, it's like for the general public, having a target is great, but how do we get there? And how soon could we expect to hear a strategy?
Yeah, so that was one of the things I was going to come back with. I think how soon we can't answer that with any great detail right now, but as soon as possible, I think, is what we're hearing today. So I'm going to go through what I've been hearing, and then we'll see if you need to add anything. So the first thing I've heard today is we want a strategy around this to be developed as soon as possible. We want to set a target of net zero by 2045. Emissions cut 57%, in line with, which is kind of based on some kind of figures and background rather than just a random target. And then I'm picking up on Jackie's point on the biogenic methane, and I'm suggesting a very aspirational target of 50% on that, because that seems to be something that we can potentially make the most impact with our community, with the kind of resources and comms that Liz is talking about. So, and also with what I've heard around some reduction of agriculture across the community as we experience that growth. So I'm just going to go to staff and see how they're feeling about that, and for any further comments, and then we'll wrap up.
I think that's great. And the only last comment question that I have is, as we tried to communicate from the beginning of the presentation, is although you declared a climate emergency in 2019, you have actually taken actions, but you have chosen not to prioritize this action. As a result, staff have put their energy to where council directed them, and we will continue to do that. If you read other council strategies, I appreciate that you do want a district-wide emission reduction strategy. I think that's absolutely great. You actually have a lot of it, and we can quite easily pull together, because if you look at what other councils are doing, you have most of those programs already in place. But what I've tried to drive home most importantly, and I can say this because just to say it, the decisions you make across the table and in regards to other aspects of work that you do across council influence what you're if you do not carry the climate change thinking across everything else that you do, you're never going to meet any strategy that you set. So it's really important to, I'm glad that it's being integrated into Vision 2050. I'm glad that you're going to work on that. At the moment, you will need to reconsider. You have 3 staff, what you want to do and where you want to put your resource and your focus. That's what I'm trying to say. So I think that that's good direction, but what I haven't heard yet, and this will be something that maybe you want to discuss later, is that last slide about what you want to do with 23-24 annual plan. Yeah.
Thanks, Brandy. I wouldn't expect staff to answer that on the hoof. And it doesn't necessarily need to be staff. We can bring in outside help to help us with this, and our community has a lot of resource in it. And
it is. Yeah. It's really important to bring down the message again. And Christina said it really well. These targets is a guiding star.
Yeah.
They're out there, and we're trying every day to work towards them.
Yeah.
And council is only one player in this discussion. Council is not the major funding in district-wide emissions reduction. We never will be, because simply we don't control it. We're a regulator. That's where we have a large tool in our hands. That's the land use planning we discussed.
Land use planning.
But everybody else, Ryman, Somerset, residents, everybody needs to get on board. So it's actually not... we can have 20 staff talking to community, but ultimately the community needs to make the change. And we're part of that community in our own households, in our own residence. As staff, we try to lead by example, and we do. As council, we lead by example because we have reduced our corporate emissions by a large part. So we're trying to lead. If council can do it, Ryman's can do it. And that's true, they can. So it's that kind of discussion, but so don't need to be hung up about what's affordable and if we can calculate these things. Because to be honest, this morning I talked about corporate emissions. Why can I calculate where we're at? Because I own the data. We have them in our systems. Do we have district-wide data on how many people are now cycling on our shared paths? We don't. We know how much we spend on building kilometers of shared paths, but how many people actually now commute on their bike to their workplace? We don't know. We have data, but it's quite hard to know if somebody is traveling for what purpose. So to actually say, do we get value for money? Are we going to meet these targets? Most of them are simply aspirational. All of these are. Nobody has completely calculated, is this going to be real in 7 years from now? But does it matter? We just need to keep going and have a guidance for our communities and pathways on how we're going to get there together. So that's just what I needed
Very well
to add.
said, Ninka. And I just want to acknowledge the huge amount of work that's gone in this space by your team. You and Brandy and others, it's just been an extraordinary amount of effort. And I remember a few councils ago, we said we were going to embed sustainability across council activities, and what I heard 3 years later is we weren't prioritising it. So I think that's something this time that we've actually managed to do. I'm not sure when council gave the instruction that this wasn't important, but I didn't hear it come around this table. I think it might be maybe a victim of the portfolio system that happened, which we don't have anymore. This council has certainly made a strong commitment to progressing this, and it will be great to progress this through Councillor Pravanov's Climate and Environment Committee. I think that's a way that we can keep this conversation rolling and keep this conversation going with our community and with our advocacy organisations and our action organisations. So, Nigel, do you have something very quick to add before we finish?
Yeah, just quickly. I think discussions around the number of staff required, etc., are purely within the gift of the chief executive. I get uncomfortable when we talk about how many people we need to do and etc., because I don't know that. I think that's a completely internal conversation.
Yeah, it's kind of nuts and bolts rather than the big picture thinking that we're trying to do today. So I just wanted to check in on that last suggestion of the 50% biogenic methane. Just check in with staff. Is it completely unrealistic or?
That target has been set by Hutt City, as far as I know, as the only council, as a sub-target. Yes, but they've adopted it as their own because they're a big landfill owner and they operate an open landfill. So when you operate a current open landfill, you can achieve a lot by having a very good gas capture system. We don't have any open landfills that we could apply that action to. So we're very dependent on working with a really good landfill. It is exactly what we're doing because our waste goes to a landfill that has a very high gas capture. But when you talk about a methane for our own district, if we were to Wairarapa, yes, lots of livestock. If we had open landfills, yes, possibly. But yeah, at this moment in time, right now, I can't answer if
Let's leave it as an aspirational goal for the moment, and we can always have more discussions around that. So I think everybody's taken a note of the steer. Does anybody disagree with those steers? The net zero by 2045 emissions cut by 57% by 2030, leaving the rest of those targets the same for 2030, just as ones that sit under there. Though, of course, we'll do as much as we can, and biogenic methane 50% as an aspirational target for now. And huge importance of having that strategy around this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to test as well.
Give Sophie the last word, actually.
Sorry, no, sorry, just jumped in. There's been a lot of conversation about how we want aspiration, which I think is awesome. Do people feel like 2040 is too aspirational? Yeah, okay, cool. Just wanted to make sure that we were, yeah.
Had to be done, had to be done.
You might want to test that again.
Yeah, could I test that again?
Yeah, we can test that around the table. Who would like to stick with 2045?
Oh, who wants? Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a 2040.
2040?
2045.
Oh.
2042 in June it is.
Oh, Christina, do people have any?
Yeah, let's have some feedback on that.
So the 2050 target in legislation, the net zero target, is enacted through emissions budgets at the national level. And the emissions budgets that have been set actually take non-biogenic methane emissions to net zero nationally in about between 2040 and 2045. They've left a gap so that they can bring international aviation and shipping into the target and still meet that 2050 window. So if you were talking about emissions not including international aviation and shipping, I think you would be fully justified in picking an earlier date.
Thank you for that. That's really useful. So let's, can I suggest we go aspirational for today? We're not making a decision today, it's a steer, and what that does is give a steer that we're serious about this as a council, because we obviously need to be quite clear when giving that message. So does anybody have a real problem if we leave today with a 2040 aspirational target? No? So we'll go to that. Darren wanted to just provide some context to finish up.
Thank you. Thanks, Your Worship. Good discussion. Thanks, Brandy and Ninka, for the session today. I really just wanted to touch on the strategy. I've been sitting here reading while we've been discussing the work that's been going on at Greater Wellington, and just wondering how that, not wondering, but understanding how that affects us. And where we can not just follow but lead. I'm a firm believer of strategies, but the strategy needs to have an implementation plan of sorts, or something that gives it some credibility. And so we are looking at what we deliver now. So coming back to that question, how quickly can we have a strategy? And Chris is back in the room, so she won't mind me saying this. So this will be something that we progress at pace. It's really important. Climate change is not just a local issue, but it's a national issue and an international issue, actually. So this is something that we will take on board. I've taken a lot from the discussion today. Thank you for everyone who's attended. It's been really interesting just to see the passion in the room. So I have heard, and we will be taking some steps.
Thanks, Darren. We're going to wrap up there today for this session. I look forward to having more sessions like this in the future, not just here, but also at the Climate and Environment Committee. Thanks for your contribution today, the members of the public who've come in today. Hugely appreciated, a valuable contribution. Thanks to community board members, councillors and staff. And we're going to have a quick lunch. We'll see you back here at 2 because we've got external presenters. Dots, put the dots on. Sarah, everybody, dots.
Don't forget your